All right, we are now recording.
Okay, cool. All right, and I'll kind of kick us off, and I'll butt in where necessary, but hopefully not too much. All right, marginal gainers. You know, we've covered a lot of different topics on this show: hysteresis, hot bifurcation, Formula One. We've talked about remote islands and the placebo effect. Every time, though, we've tried to circle it back to bikes, hopefully successfully. And mostly that's been drop bar and mostly road bikes. But we're going to branch out a little bit here and get into the world of downhill racing, where races are literally decided by 1/100ths of a second. So obviously, in that kind of racing, especially on the highest level, marginal gains matter. And the area we're going to focus on today is suspension setup, and how that gets done on a very, very high level. And to help us with that, we have brought in Nick Lester. Now, Nick runs a company called Dynamics. Basically, it is data acquisition, and he's a telemetry specialist. He has worked with the Commensal 100% team, and currently is the team manager for the Muck-Off Young Guns downhill team. So, Nick, Nick, I knew you were the right guy for this show when I was going through your Instagram page this morning, looking at pictures and graphs and all kinds of stuff above my pay grade, and I saw a paragraph from you that said, bikes are complicated and riders are more complicated, which means the whole lot needs to be viewed holistically in order to optimize the performance from both. And I went, oh, he's the right guy for this show. So, Nick Lester, welcome to this world. Welcome to the Marginal Gains Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be honest with you, I hadn't listened to the podcast until I had a chat with Alan Milway at one of the World Cup races, and he introduced me to your podcast, and since then I've sort of been binging on it a bit because it's fascinating.
Yeah. We love it.
Well, thank you.
It's not a bad show.
If I was just thinking, if that were my Instagram post, I would have just said it depends.
That is a default answer a lot of times.
So, Nick, you've built your life and your world around downhill racing, but before downhill racing, I understand you were a bit of a time trialist and rode some velodrome?
Yeah, I was. I mean, even then I was still... my favorite was still mountain biking. I just wasn't any good at it. And I used to race cross country for a little bit, and I don't really have the build for that. And it was just suffering. I mean, you could argue time trialing is just suffering for X amount of time, but I enjoyed it. It felt harder cross country mountain biking. And then I can't remember how I got into time trialing, but I really, really enjoyed it. It turns out I wasn't too bad at it. And then I gave the velodrome a try, and that was pretty cool as well. So yeah, I think, the time trialing aspect of it, I learned a lot about bike performance and the human element of it when I was time trialing, even though I was like, I don't know, mid to late teens. Mid-teens. I was not paying as much attention to it as I would do if I was going to have a go now.
It's a hard one to look back like that, right? And go, oh, if I'd only known, or if I'd only believed in that thing back then. So it's a good message for the kids out there. Listen to us.
It is.
That's excellent. So you find yourself kind of coming out of this world. Did you yourself race downhill as well?
No, not
or
till
did you... Okay.
No, I didn't start racing downhill till 2016, I think. I'd always wanted to. When I got into mountain biking, downhill was still relatively new. Well, it's still very new. There wasn't downhill bikes. People were still doing it on sort of standard cross-country bikes, or they were starting to modify cross-country bikes. And then when downhill bikes became a thing, they also became a very expensive thing, which my parents couldn't afford. That's the excuse they gave me. I think a lot of it, they didn't want to see me get hurt either. So I was sort of coached away from that. But I was still fascinated with it. And it's something I always did as a rider, but never competed in until much later on.
And so how did you go from downhill curious to downhill data? How did those two worlds come together?
It's like an absolute fascination with the sport. So being a massive fan of it, watching every race multiple times, and listening to there used to be a mechanic called Dave Garland who was he was a high profile mechanic, and I remember him doing a podcast back in 2017, I think, about a system he was working on, and that's what got me interested in the performance side of downhill and how the bikes are such a key factor in it, but now also how we can measure that and understand with metrics how they're working. And then from there I just fell into this rabbit hole of data acquisition, and I was always a big fan of Formula One and how motorsport have used it, and been curious as to how that could apply to mountain biking, and then it was applied to mountain biking, and that's where I found I could really apply myself.
Yeah, no, that's impressive. So how much are you self-taught? How much do you kind of learn through working in that work? Because, I mean, this is complicated stuff for, I've got some experience here from car racing 20 plus years ago, and we've done some other stuff. But I mean, you've got to know electrical engineering, the systems, the physics, the science. I mean, it's not just like, oh, here's these 10 things to bolt on your bike and you'll get an answer. Tell us about that journey, because that, for all the listeners at home, I mean, this stuff is insanely complicated and interconnected.
Yeah, and it's still not that widely understood. That the systems available now, they make it look like it's very easy. You just bolt some sensors on and all the data's pre-formatted, and they make it look very easy. But it depends on what level you want to go to. So when I had a phone call with Dave a few years after hearing that podcast, when he was working on his own data acquisition system. So I had a phone call with him about it, and I decided I was going to make the investment and buy one of his systems. But the main selling point for that, for me, was not only how good the system was, but also I would get taught it by Dave, which was a huge plus for me, because he was someone who I saw as being at the very forefront of that field, as well as all his other mechanical experience and understanding of suspension. So I spent the next sort of 3 months, I think, on the phone to him almost daily for hours at a time, where he was teaching me how to read these graphs and how the sensors worked and the way the logger works, and then how you can also interpret the graphs into a mechanical change on the bike, not just suspension, but geometry, rider position, because some of them also measure braking, and so you can see all sorts of stuff. So there was a lot of things to learn, and Dave was really good at talking me through everything. The really unfortunate thing was that Dave then passed away in November of 2020, so I didn't get anywhere near as long with Dave learning these skills as I would have liked, but those 3 months were invaluable.
Wow. Yeah, so you're all of a sudden in the deep end.
System?
Huh?
Yeah, that's the Stendec system, yeah. And that was in at the deep end as well. There was, I believe, at that time, that might have been the only one you could buy specifically for mountain biking. There's a company Josh might know of called AIM, who are heavily involved in motorsport. And they make a system, or they've got a version of their system which works with bikes, and that's been used at World Cups as well. But Dave, the Stendec system was the first one I came across, and it was, probably still is, more advanced than a lot of others in some ways, a lot harder to get your head around. But yeah, it was because the software for it is great, but understanding how to read it all, compared to the newer systems like the BYB and the Motion Instruments, the Stendec isn't the place I would recommend to start.
Yeah. So give us an idea of, how many sensors are you kind of reading data from in a standard setup?
So you have typically you have a potentiometer on the fork and one on the shock, and they're measuring position and speeds mainly. You have loggers either in the sensors inside the logger, which is typically mounted to the frame, and there'll be accelerometers and gyroscopes, so they'll measure rotations and accelerations. So from that you can see chassis movement to a certain degree. Then you can have braking sensors, and they can range from just magnetic sensors that measure lever movement to oil pressure sensors, which is the sort of what the Stendec uses. And you have GPS, you have wheel speed, and then that's it really.
So how, I guess, walk us through, how are you kind of compiling this to paint the picture? I think of, in automotive, I think, we tend to break it down to like, my experience trace, you're looking at traces of like, brake pedal trace, lap to lap to lap, here you're getting on the brake a tenth of a second later, you're on the accelerator earlier or with a different, steepness of the curvature, right? So you're, I guess, how are you compiling the data to paint a picture, or like a holistic picture, or are you then using it to look at like really more specific things, I guess, related to performance?
It depends what you're using the system for. So when I'm working with a customer through my business, we have a specific goal. Generally it's just to get the bike set up better. So we're looking at how the suspension's behaving, what sort of ride height they get or dynamic sag, the use of travel, the balance in compression and rebound speeds front to back. And then in a race situation, the same applies. Like that's fundamentally what the system's on for, to get the bike set up as quickly as possible, because at a World Cup you have very limited track time. So the quicker you can get the bike in, not perfect, but 80% of the way there, then the more time the rider has to focus on looking at line choice and braking points. And then that's when you start to really dive into the other side of the data. Once the bike's set up or in a place where the rider feels like they can push a lot harder, then I start looking at where the rider's braking, where they should be braking, or can they brake earlier, or do they know they're braking here? And then I'm also then looking at the data from the chassis mounted sensors to understand if there's a way we can make the bike more stable or more predictable, or so there's different ways of using it depending on what your goal is.
Where do tires and tire pressure fit into all that data acquisition?
So tire choice and tire pressures typically are they're not something you measure with the data acquisition specifically. With a system like the Stendec, for example, it doesn't have potentiometers, so sliding moving sensors on the fork or the shock. It has accelerometers on each axle, and because of the type of data that collects, you can take into account tire construction, tire pressure, wheel construction as well, to fine-tune how those bump forces are handled, not just by the suspension but by the wheel and tire as well. But tire choice comes down to the type of terrain and the type of conditions you're in, and then tire pressure it's sometimes rider preference, but a lot of the time what I've understood is sometimes the riders don't understand why they run these pressures. They typically have a go-to pressure of maybe 24 psi in the front and 26 in the back, and that's what they've always run. But then once you start working with a rider and you've got their bike working a lot better, what I found is you can go down in pressure, and then you can find even more grip for the rider without sacrificing roll-in speed or braking performance, even stability at high speed, you can then really sort of educate the rider a little bit as to why you don't necessarily need to run the pressures you've always run.
Makes sense. So do you, or it sounds like no, but are you guys looking at, I would think, something like that kind of rate of gain essentially at the accelerometers located at the axles, that's going to give you some kind of some indication of the tire's responsiveness, right? Since you're, essentially you're getting that fraction of a second that the casing is compressing, is going to control, probably what that, like the first derivative of acceleration on that tire. I mean, are you guys kind of diving into things like that to make prescriptive, oh gosh, this looks steeper than it should. Let's take it shallower, or is it? Because I do know at the other side of the coin, you still, like you said, the rider. I mean, just like any athlete or race car driver, like sometimes technically the right thing is actually the wrong thing because the human doesn't agree with it, right?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the time, it's not something I use the system for, because especially, so the only real one I can look at that sort of thing is the Stendec. But the Stendec hasn't been updated for a long time now because it's not even available anymore. So like the sample rate, for example, isn't quite high enough to fully, really dive deeply into that. But what you can see, like I would be able to tell you if a rider had an insert in their tire using the Stendec system, and I couldn't necessarily tell you that with any of the other systems, because you can see deflection slightly.
Interesting.
So it just gives you an idea, and then a lot of it, as with all of these data systems, it's all a case of having a conversation with the rider as well, because the data will only tell you half the story. What the rider is experiencing on the bike and what the rider needs the bike to do is the other half of the story. So it's, and tire pressure, tire choice, to a certain extent, is rider preference and what they're feeling the wheels doing underneath them.
Yeah, it's such a piece of the confidence, right?
Oh,
so
absolutely, yeah.
You talked about, and it makes sense, using the system to get the bike, 80% of the way there. As quick as possible. How many runs are you typically, do these guys get before they're running for time?
So typically you get, I think maybe 7 or 8 runs that are actually constructive runs. So they get a certain amount of practice time, and the first run of each day typically is just a sighting run, a bit of a system check on the bike and the data system, seeing how the conditions have affected the track overnight, or just evaluating stuff. So then you might get 6 or 7 runs after that before the rider then has to go up and do their qualifying run, which is the first run that really matters. And that's not a lot of time to get the bike set up and learn the track, especially if it's a new venue, and also take into account, looking at lines and different line choices. And so there's a lot for a rider to get their head around before they actually have to put a run down in anger.
Yeah. That's nice. That's more than I would have thought.
Yeah, in those test runs, are they able to give you a max effort, so you have an understanding and the data shows exactly what they're going to get when they go for that final run? I mean, a lot of athletes will save our best performance for when we absolutely need it. Can a World Cup downhiller go out and give you that, simulate that performance in one of those qualifying runs or one of those practice runs?
In a quali run, it's it does matter. It's hard though. So a rider won't want to do a proper race effort until it's absolutely necessary because of the risk involved as well. So typically the riders I've worked with are sort of practicing, they're building up to around 90 odd % of an effort. So then you sort of get a gauge when you've worked with a rider for a little while. You get a gauge of where their practice efforts are compared to where their qualifying or race efforts are going to be. And then from that, you can sort of preempt where the bike needs to be for that run in order to make sure that they can go that extra 5 or 7%, and the bike's still going to behave how they want it to behave. Because that extra 5 or 7% means they're going to be hitting certain bumps that bit faster, or the bike needs to recover from hits a little bit quicker. So it's important that the bike can, when they want to step up their performance, that the bike doesn't, they don't step outside of the performance window of the bike.
Right.
That's interesting. So I guess how are you kind of baking? Are you baking that into the settings? Okay, when you go, this is 80%. When you go 100%, that's one click away. Or I guess help me through that kind of optimization calculation.
Yeah, so we get the bike working. We get the bike to sort of 80% of the way where it needs to be within 3 runs, I'd say. And then a lot of it is small changes based on rider feedback as they go quicker, and as the track evolves. So the track will deteriorate the more riders that get on it. So then line choices will change and braking points will change, and then so the last tweaking is done with data and rider feedback. And then, like I say, once you work with a rider for a certain amount of time, you do get to understand how much quicker they're going to go in their quali run or their race run. And then, so for example, when they finish practice and they go up for their quali run, they're not necessarily going to go that much quicker, maybe 2 or 3% quicker. So you don't, I might add a little bit of compression to help give them some additional support because they're going to be going that bit quicker. And then with the race run this year, we've had a race setting that we put in, which typically it's not a set thing. It's not like 2 clicks of this or 1 click of that. It's very much dependent on that is dependent on what I've seen in the data from the practice before, and then what the rider's telling me he's doing on track and what the bike's doing on track. So it's still not a sort of, there's no formula to, not that I've come up with anyway, to apply a race setting to a bike. It's still a little bit of, it's still a little bit analog, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've heard you talk about the 4 areas that impact suspension performance. Could you go over this real quick for us? Give us a layout of what the major things we're looking at as far as suspension performance.
Yeah, so typically, if I'm working with a new rider, what we need to make sure is right first is that the ergonomics of the bike are right. So the rider is in the right position on the bike. The handlebars are in the right position, brake levers and everything, so that all affects their body weight. So that's one of the first things to get right. And then you have the geometry of the bike. So then you're looking at some bikes have got geometry you can change, so they have flip chips in the shock, so in the shock position, so you can change how progressive it is, and then you can change things like wheelbase with flip chips in the rear axle, and you can change reach and head angle with headsets. So getting those things right first, those are sort of fundamentals before we start looking at suspension settings. Then you get into the suspension setup, getting the basics right, so the spring right first, making sure the static sag is in the right position. And then after that, you're looking at sort of what the rider is doing to affect the performance of the bike. So how they're braking, how much of that is front braking versus rear braking, and how much of that they're applying and where they're applying it.
And so in there, I guess I'm interested. Can you see things? You talked about the track deteriorating, which is one thing that to me seems like it would just be so hard to contend with on the data acquisition side. You know, in motor racing, the track changes, but it changes slowly and generally in a direction. You know, like it gets rubbered in, and you know here it's degrading, and so you know, are you looking specifically at things like, ooh, this amount of brake line pressure resulted in this many G's of stopping force last run, and now, you know, 3 runs later, it's 10%. We're getting 10% less stopping force for the same. I don't know. My brain like spins with just like, oh God, these would be so hard to even think, because you have to think to look for them, right? It's, you know, I think for the people who don't do this stuff, it's not, you know, the softwares don't go like, hey, look here.
No, I wish.
You know, you got to sort of like form the hypothesis and then go look at the data and see if, you know, because there may be nothing there. So,
yeah, a lot of it when we look at track deterioration or how the track evolves, a lot of it relies on a different data acquisition tool, which is just a GoPro camera. So the riders will always practice with a GoPro on, and they'll record every run, and that, along with their feedback, gives me an idea of how the track is deteriorating. And how quickly it's deteriorating. At the beginning of the race weekend, I'll go and do a track walk with them, and I'm there purely just to have a look at the track and understand what the bikes are going to be facing, and how the riders might approach it. And we talk line choice as well, so I get an idea of what the track's like at the beginning of the weekend, and then they will do a day's practice, and then the riders will typically then go and do another track walk afterwards, because the track's been abused for a day and it changes quite a lot. So there's constant looking at the track, whether that's on track by foot or with GoPros. Seeing that in the data is a lot harder to do. It's a lot when you get an extreme change, like a weather change, for example. It might have been dry one day and then absolutely tipped it down the next day. Then braking points and braking pressures become a lot easier to look at, because it's such an extreme change. But with track evolution, over the course of a day, when the conditions have stayed the same, it's a lot harder to see in a data acquisition system. And a lot of it depends on how consistently the rider is riding, how consistently they're on the same line, which isn't the case. They'll be trying different lines. They'll be getting quicker as the day goes on. So it's really hard to look at compression and rebound speeds to see if they're hitting stuff harder and if the holes are getting bigger, because they're going faster and they might not even be on the same line. So using a data acquisition system for that is, I would say, nearly impossible. But GoPros and rider feedback and actually just old school walking the track is a much better way of getting a handle on how much the track is changing.
And how about static cameras? Can cameras placed along course or your own eyeballs along course inform your decision about setup?
Yeah, the video footage is just as useful as data from a system. So being able to see a POV run from the rider is really good, but also having someone trackside videoing not just your rider but other riders to look at line choice and see what lines they're taking and what lines are working is really, really good. But when they are videoing your rider and you get a clip of your rider, you can see how the bike's behaving. So you can see how fast the forks are compressing or rebounding. You can see how much of that is being transferred up to the handlebars and how much the rider is then having to deal with those forces through their arms. Is it affecting their upper body and their head? And then you can get an idea of how well the bike is isolating those bump forces from the rider and keeping the bike stable and predictable. It all depends on how well it's been shot, of course, but it is a pretty useful tool when you get a really good clip come through from a someone else on track, or one of the photographers from a website has managed to get a good clip of your rider come through. I can spend far too long looking at that, seeing how the bike's working.
Yeah. And then can you match that up with your data set, with the sensor data you get? Can you take video and match it up precisely and cross-reference that way?
You can with the GoPro footage from the helmet. You can perfectly sync that with the data from the data acquisition system. It's a lot harder to do it from when you get a clip from someone trackside, because you don't know when that, you don't exactly know when that clip has started, and it's hard to find that in the data you've got from that run. But yeah, when you've got a GoPro, a head cam footage, it's really cool to be able to, especially the braking, so you can exactly see on track where that rider's braking. And if you just look at a GPS trace of the track and you can see the braking points on that squiggly line, you might question why a rider is dragging their brakes through that corner, or why they're not braking when there's a straighter section beforehand. But then when you look at the GoPro footage, you can see actually braking in that area is not viable because there's really wet roots going across it, or actually they need to brake around that corner because it helps turn the bike in and stuff like that.
That's cool. So are the riders then using, are you guys then using sort of the footage in combination with the data trace to sort of like train the next, the next run, or find the best segments,
It's not necessarily the next run. It's something we would do at the end of the day. Maybe we would take the fastest run from that day, because you can get quite accurate timing from a GoPro run. Using software, you can get a pretty accurate time of that run as long as the rider doesn't stop. That's the other hard thing, is getting a full run in where the rider doesn't. Sometimes the rider will want to stop and have a look at a line choice, or they'll get held up by another rider or a red flag. So on the rare opportunity you can get a full run in on practice, then we can sync up the data with that. We can go through it in the evening and have a look at where the rider is braking and have a conversation about, is there an opportunity here to brake better or clean up your braking, make several braking spikes. Maybe we can turn them into one neater braking event earlier on, so the bike is more stable when you come into a corner. Trying to do that during a day's practice when you have such limited time is a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Earlier you mentioned static sag and dynamic sag. Can you inform us on what the differences are there? I mean, a lot of us know, you set up your sag, you get on, you get your pack on, you sit on your bike, you put a little rubber O-ring down there, and you check your sag. But what's dynamic sag about, and how does that help inform your setup decisions?
Dynamic sag is much more useful than static sag. Static sag is a good place to start if you're on a brand new bike or you've got brand new suspension. It's a good place to make sure you're in the right area with regards to your spring rate or your air pressure in your air spring. But dynamic sag you can only get with a data acquisition system, and it will give you your average position in the suspension stroke during that run, which is a much better way of understanding where the bike sits for the most of the time during that run, and what the geometry looks like when the bike is in its natural position with the rider on, so to speak. So if you might have a static sag of 26% front and rear, then when you get on track and you start pushing, that dynamic sag, that static sag changes to a dynamic sag of closer to 30%. So then that's why the two figures are different, and why the dynamic sag is more important, because it's more relevant to what's actually happening when the rider's on the bike riding.
And are you always hoping to see an increased value in dynamic sag over static?
You're not necessarily hoping to see it. It's typical because there's more variation. Although measuring static sag consistently is a nightmare, because each time the rider sits on the bike, it's not exactly the same, and you can make a change. they might be getting 23% static sag on the fork. So you take some air pressure out, they get on the bike, and it still measures 23% static sag, even though you've taken out 5 or 6, 7 psi. So static sag is, it's a good place to get a ballpark figure, but I don't spend too long looking into that because it doesn't mean a great deal in the real world.
How? Listen to you say that. I hadn't. How is heating affect that? Are you seeing that change through the course of a run as the your seals get hot, your air gets hot, your fluids get hot?
It's definitely a factor.
What's
it's
that?
Not.
Yeah.
There's a system I'm developing for use with my team next year, which will be able to measure temperatures. So we can put temperature sensors on the brakes or the shock if we need to. It's not something I do at the minute because it's tricky to do with the current systems we have. But I know that, and this always reminds me of a conversation I had with Dave where, especially in the shock, not so much in the fork, but the shock is a much smaller unit with the oil has a much harder life in the shock than it does in the fork. So it heats up a lot more, and you can, when a rider comes down after a run, the piggyback reservoir on the shock where most of the heat builds up can be pretty hot at times. You're looking at least 70, 80 degrees Celsius sometimes, maybe hotter than that. And that will affect the viscosity of the oil. So it typically affects the rebound more from what I've seen. So your rebound speeds will become quicker. And it can feel like the bike is a little unpredictable in certain sections. But then the really tricky thing is 20 or 30 seconds down the track, that shock could have cooled down a little bit, and then your rebound is back in control of where it should be. And then you have an intermittent problem, which is really hard to diagnose and hard for the rider to get their head around. So that's why I feel it's something really important that we can try and measure, because if we can understand, if a rider can say, oh, during this section the bike felt like it was a bit unpredictable, or the back end felt a bit sort of loose and wild, you can then look at that in the data. You can cross-reference that with temperature data from the shock and say, actually, the shock was getting really, really hot, so that's what you're feeling. It's not a case, and then we don't make an erratic judgment and slow the rebound down when actually that's not the problem. It's a temperature problem.
Makes sense.
If that makes sense.
And are you guys, pardon my, this is not my world, so I'm pretty ignorant here. Are you guys on coils, or are you on air shocks rear? Or and I guess forks as well. Is that all back to coil again?
I mean, I try and encourage coil in the rear shock as much as possible, because it's just more efficient at dealing with bump forces. It's got less friction than an air shock. Despite the oil temperature change, the same thing happens in an air shock, but you also get air temperature change in an air shock. So there's more variables in an air shock. Right. So I will always, if the bike allows, and the bike design and the kinematics of the bike will determine whether or not, for a large part, it will determine whether or not a coil shock is an option. If you can run a coil shock, we always try to. The Mondraker bikes we run this year, luckily, all work much better with a coil shock than an air shock. And the forks typically are, the majority of World Cup bikes are all air sprung forks. There are some coil ones out there, and it's, again, I think the same applies. Like a coil fork will handle bump forces more efficiently than a air sprung fork, but it's hard to find a good fork that uses a coil unless you are a factory team that has full factory support from a suspension manufacturer that are willing to do that.
Yeah, makes sense. But yeah, because I mean, the way you describe it, I mean, you're facing oil viscosity is dropping, rebound damping is going away, and air pressure is now rising, and so it's like that's a challenging one to deal with in that moment.
And I can't
what's
see
the length. Yeah.
I can't see any of this in the data really, because it's, like I say, it's intermittent. It happens when the shock heats up and then cools down, and then it's hard for it's harder for the rider to diagnose as well. There's a specific point. They just think the bike is not where they want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah, because in the acceleration data, that it's just more acceleration, right? Or different there's no way to really put your finger on it and say this is thermally induced, and up until then we were fine. Yeah, that's a fascinating problem.
Yeah, fascinating is one word for
it. Be a good it'd be a fun use. I mean, they probably don't handle shock well, but it'd be a great use for infrared cameras, the FLIR cameras. We had a lot of experience with those, developing brake systems and carbon rims for braking and things like that. But that would be a cool one to piggyback on your GoPro looking forward, FLIR infrared looking down.
Yeah,
I wonder what you could see in there.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. But, I'd love to figure out a way that we can make that happen. I do try I've got an infrared thermometer that I keep in my toolbox, but it very rarely comes out, because by the time a bike has finished a run and come back to the pits where I am, the temperature's already dropped off a lot. So unless I'm stood at the bottom taking readings all the time, it's really hard. And then that's not necessarily the hottest the shock's got. So real-time measurement of it would be great, whether that's with a camera or just a temperature sensor connected to the logger. But I do feel it's pretty essential in order to fully understand what's happening on the bike.
A World Cup downhiller, like a lot of professional racers, have a lot on their plate. They consider a lot of things: diet, training, sleep, all of that. In their world, for a World Cup downhill racer, could you quantify how much this area matters to them? Suspension setup, how much meaning does it have behind their successful runs?
I'm going to default to one of Josh's answers and say it depends. Because
always the right answer.
A lot of it will depend on what rider you're working with. So I feel like it's changing more now, but it wasn't that long ago that some riders would have a base setup in their bike, and they would not change that through the whole season. They would just rather get on a bike that feels familiar and learn to ride it as it is on that track. But as you spoke about how close the race times are getting now, the performance of the suspension is such a huge part in finding that time, that most riders are fully understanding that this is just as big a part of their performance at that event as their sleep is, their training, their nutrition, sports psychology. And also, it does play a massive part on the psychology of the athlete as well. When they're sat in the starter hut and they know that bike is working as best as it can do, it's one less variable for them to have to worry about, one less excuse they've got.
That makes a lot of sense. If you can get them to trust, as we've talked about before, you get them to trust the right answer. That's a powerful combination for an athlete. Right? You believe in it, and it works.
Exactly.
Another thing I saw you starting to work with, Nick, that caught my eye, only because I see it in my audio editing software, the letters FFT. I went, uh-oh. Nick is really going deep here. So tell us what, if you can, in the simplest terms, tell us what FFT is and how it applies to what you're doing.
So this is something I'm relatively new to, but part of understanding the performance of a suspension isn't just knowing how fast it's moving and what position it's in, but it's also understanding what's causing that speed and position movement. So the FFT analysis helps me to understand the frequency and the amplitude of a factor. So in this case, it's with suspension, it's typically bump force and so how often those bumps happen and the size of those forces. And when you can see how when you, for example, with the post I put up recently was to look at how a fork is dealing with these bump forces and how that is then affecting the chassis. So it's just another way of taking the data from the unit, the logger, processing it a different way to get another perspective on what's happening with the bike. And like I say, in this case, it's frequency and amplitude of a variable. So you can use it for braking as well. You can use it for suspension. You can use it for chassis movement. It's a way of analyzing the frequency of an event or a variable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for the listeners, so FFT's Fast Fourier transform, and it's actually cool. I don't know if you guys know the backstory of the FFT. It's like it's one of my favorite engineering stories. It's so the Fourier transformation is basically you transforming a system into the frequency domain, and like engineers do that a lot. Like we'll move things from one domain to the other so that we can understand it. And this is putting it in the frequency domain, but like the straight up old school Fourier's version of his transform is like you're doing it basically like for each frequency, like each sine wave and cosine wave. And it was post World War II when they were trying to figure out, the U.S. was trying to figure out if the Russians were doing underground nuclear testing. And you could read seismic waves, but we didn't know, like, is that a nuclear test or an earthquake? And some of the guys from the original Manhattan Project said, oh, well, we can use a Fourier transform and determine if that's a bomb or an earthquake. But it would take, 1,000 people hand computing for a year to figure it out. And one of the guys realized that, when you have sine waves and cosine waves, like you get all these overlapping data points. And so it basically is this super condensed way of doing like a transform matrix that'll give you like almost the same answer with this tiny fraction of the calculation. And so it's another one of those weird, you see it, it's used everywhere. Audio, certainly in this world, any time you want to try to understand frequency. We talk a lot about aeroelasticity and vehicle dynamics, all that stuff. But I just always love that story of like what a tiny esoteric weird problem to try to solve. And then when they did it and unleashed it on the world, there's just so much stuff. All this, you think of, so much of this, like audio compression, MP3s, all that stuff was allowed because of this one thing. That, before that, like if you want to compress an audio file, you had these huge losses. And because of Fast Fourier, you can do it with relatively minimal. It's not my world. I don't know all the details, but I love the backstory.
Yep.
Yeah, it's
Nick, I think it sounds like your work. Obviously, your work ultimately is to. Go ahead, Nick. That's fine. Sorry.
I was just going to say you did a much better job of explaining it than me. It's something I'm relatively new to, and I'm not entirely sure of its use yet. I found it quite useful in understanding, in just visualizing another way of what's happening and another tool to use as a comparison. So. I find it fascinating, but I'm yet to determine if it's actually useful.
Yeah, I think, and again, not of your world, but for me, it was always this fascination of you can take what looks like nonsense or scatter shot and run it and actually end up with some waveform. It suddenly looks like something. And I think the other use for it from my history is you may have something you think is like waveform or has some waveform component to it, but you don't know, and you run FFT on it, and it's not waveform at all. And now right? Right.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a, it works as kind of a nice blade on things like, oh, should I go chasing harmonics and frequency and all that? Oh, let's run this. And you go, yep, nope, that's not it. I need to look, I can go look elsewhere now. But yeah, I think the act of simplification and kind of getting you into essentially a relatively tight range of frequencies and amplitudes to look at, it's huge, right? Because otherwise you have to form a hypothesis, pick a place to say, well, is this a high frequency problem or a low frequency problem? Is this there's a million things you have to think about and then go test. And here you can run it and have a pretty good idea of like, oh, we've got 3 bands of primary, frequency or whatever, and it gives you some indication of where to go looking. Because again, none of this, we talk about all this software and all this stuff and all these systems and all this cool tech on the show all the time, but I think people who don't live in it every day don't realize that, like, it's just like looking at a bunch of spreadsheets. It's like, nobody ever gives you a spreadsheet and you're like, oh, clearly, this is the answer. It's like, oh, I now have 10 hours of data to pour through and I have to form 27 different hypotheses. And then your experience begins to pay, and that, oh, well, generally it's this or it's that. But, I think that's for me, I think the most important element of all this is that these tools just give us so much more data, but man, they damn them, they just never tell you how to solve the problem.
No, and that's one of the reasons why I started. So with the Stendec and the BYB system, which is another data acquisition system, you can export the data in a raw format, and then I've found that in a race situation, their proprietary software gives you pretty much everything you need to get the bike where you want to get it, so the rider can ride fast and confidently. But later on, when you want to dive as deep as you want to dive, the ability to then take that raw data, run it through whatever calculations, formulas, processes you've got to find other information, that's where I lose days of time and disappearing down rabbit holes. And the FFT was another one where I found that it can be useful, and you can use it to rule out other things as well. If it's not useful, it's still useful because it's ruled something else out.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Can I ask, do you guys, Hottie, did you know Stendec from before? I'm not familiar with them.
Nope. Nope, not until I started researching Nick Lester, and I'm like, oh, Stendec, what the heck's this?
Do you know them, Nick? Because another rabbit hole story, everybody knows I'm a big aviation nut, but Stendec is like a super famous aviation story. And I think they were like British Air Force pilots, and I can't remember, flying like Lancasters or something, but they crashed after essentially Morse coding Stendec like repeatedly, and it was like this huge it was just this huge mystery of like what happened to this plane. And one of the theories is that they lost cabin pressure and went hypoxic, and they were just transposing the letters of the word descent or descend, but they kept keying it in. And so there's all these theories of like, was it aliens? Was it whatever? So I was just interested to know the brand Stendec was that somebody having fun, or was this like, oh no, his name that was somebody's last name, or whatever. But
no, I don't.
Another terrible Josh rabbit hole story, right?
I don't know anything about that, and I feel like that's something I probably should have asked Dave, really, where the name came from. I might be able to find out. There's a couple of other people that still use it, so maybe I can find that out. But that's a pretty cool story. I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, if you could figure that would be awesome. Because they're not, I think, God, years ago we were running a lot of like Pi Research, and oh God, who's the other one there was an Italian one for a while. And I know the stuff that's out there now is so much better and than it was 25 years ago when I last kind of played in this world. But that's super interesting. So what, I guess, can you, for our listeners who are of this world, right? Are there, I don't want you to give away like your secrets, but are there some standard standard advice, outside of it depends that you see people generally doing wrong or often doing wrong that are kind of like first places to look at to make improvements?
Yeah, I mean, I nearly said it depends then, but it's a lot of it
which is true. It's a good answer.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
No,
it depends what the rider wants the bike to do, but the main areas that always need to be addressed. It doesn't matter who I work with. It's getting your sag in the right place. People typically run less sag than they, not that they should, but than is recommended. And I think a lot of concerns with that is that if you run more sag, then the damping's going to have a harder time coping with it, and you're just going to end up blowing through the travel and bottoming out all the time, which isn't true. So the sag it's basically getting your spring rate right, which gets your sag right. And then most people typically run their bikes too firm and too slow. So too much compression damping and too much rebound damping. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that I think a lot of people are under the belief that a stiff bike is a fast bike. And with regards to rebound, the most common thing I hear is that they don't want the rebound too fast, especially in the back, because they then feel like the back end is trying to kick them off the bike, especially on jumps. And again, a lot of that is more partly down to rider technique, or again, incorrect compression damping is a bigger culprit for that than rebound damping. So they're the areas I'd suggest typically that need looking at first, is spring rate and damping, which I know sounds like that's most suspension things, but they're typically so far away from where they should be in order just to make the bike feel better, that the rider feels like it's much better that they go and buy a new fork. That's going to make the difference, rather than actually you can get your current fork working a lot better and save yourself £1,000 and you'll be over the moon with your bike.
Yeah, got it. So you got me thinking, talking there. So if you're, in my mind, your dynamic sag and static sag are kind of like dynamic friction, static friction, or stiffness, I'm sorry, dynamic stiffness versus static stiffness. But in this case, you do have this ability for like adding rebound is going to essentially appear as increased static or dynamic stiffness, right? I'm in the right part of my curve. Yeah. So adding rebound will give you a steeper return line on your hysteresis graph, right? So you're at a higher dynamic stiffness at that point. Is that, I guess, if people are tending to run too much rebound, then essentially are they compensating for that by trying to run lower pressures? But then they're also running, is that closing the loop as to why they're running too much compression damping?
So too much rebound damping means the rebound is going to be slow. So that's typically going to make your dynamic sag, that potentially is going to make your dynamic sag more, because the bike's not going to recover from one impact to the next. So you're going to be sitting in that travel a lot more.
And that next impact is going to come at a higher stiffness point in the curve because you're already compressed, right? Yeah. So your dynamic stiffness is going to run much higher when you're overly rebound damped.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It just got me thinking. So like all of a sudden the bike, and I do think that that's a thing that people don't think about with these, things like theoretically the damping is separate from stiffness, but from a rider's perspective, it will make the bike feel stiffer. Yeah, it just makes me wonder if that's causing people to. It seems like that would put you in a doom loop where you're like, oh, I need to lower my, in an air shock, I need to lower my air pressure because this is too stiff. But maybe I'm overthinking that.
No, you're definitely along the right lines. People people will compensate for that with damping adjustments when, or the wrong damping adjustments as well. So a rider can complain that the bike feels harsh or stiff, but when you look at the compression data, or you just look at where the compression damping settings are at, it doesn't look like a damping problem. But what's happening is where the rebound isn't quick enough, the next impact feels harsh, which lets the rider, or can lead the rider to believe that the bike is too stiff, when actually the compression damping is what's typically related to bike stiffness. That's fine, but the fact that it's not recovering quick enough from one hit to the next can make it feel like it's too harsh. So it's just a bit of, sometimes a little bit of just education on what damping does what, and how they can cross over helps a rider a lot.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because I could see where, especially for the newer, I mean, like myself, I don't ride mountain bikes, don't ride full suspension ever. I could see where you would get your brain in that thing of like, oh wow, this feels too stiff, right? And now you're in completely the wrong place doing completely the wrong stuff, and it's all just that you're stuck at this high dynamic stiffness part of the curve. How, I guess you'd mentioned kinematics earlier. What's sort of the modern school of thought kinematically? Like, what are these bikes generally doing in terms of, like, are they rising rate, falling rate, or neutral? Like, kind of, what's the...
They're typically... Typically they're quite progressive. Sort of 20 to 25% progression. And that, knowing that will determine whether or not you're better off with an air shock or a coil shock, because a coil shock is very linear. So if you have a bike that's got a progressive kinematic, then you can run a coil shock is the dream scenario. Whereas a bike like the Mondraker we run, it's very progressive, over 25%, I think. So if you were to put an air shock on that, air shocks typically are very progressive, even without you can add volume spacers to reduce the volume in the air cam, which makes it more progressive as you go through the stroke. So the kinematics of the bike tend to err on this. They are progressive, but then they have obviously varying levels of that depending on their design.
Got it. So you put an air shock on a very progressive frame, and you're like nonlinear on nonlinear, or you're rising rate on rising rate, and now you're So I could see where they're like, if you're overly rebound damped, and all of a sudden you're in the steep ass part of that curve, right at towards the end of the stroke, and you like it's like a hardtail, right?
Yeah. If you can get to the end of the stroke, it's so progressive. You're only going to end up using about 80% of your travel. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. No, this is super fascinating.
Absolutely. Nick, for us drop bar roadie types, our only suspension are the tires generally, and us, and the person above for the most part. But I was curious what you thought we might see if we took the Stendec system or a system like that and put it on a rigid bike, a gravel bike, a road bike. Could we learn something, whether it be, rider positioning or tire pressure or frame compliance? Could we learn anything by putting sensors on a road bike and taking it out for runs?
I want to say that if you've got a system that has a high enough sample rate, and you have sensors in the right place, the biggest gain, I would say, and we've learned this in mountain biking as well, is the compliance of the frame. In mountain biking, the frames are generally on the side of being too stiff. Now, in a World Cup race situation, you're looking at 1% of riders. So for the mass market, that's not really a problem. But racing at World Cup level, you look at frame compliance and chassis stability. The stiffness of the bike becomes quite a big factor in it. And that, I believe, is probably going to be an area where road cycling can probably learn quite a lot. I'm a little out of touch with that world, so I'm not sure. There's a lot of carbon fiber and a lot of work goes into how that's laid up and compliance in the right areas. So I feel like you guys have probably done more work on that than mountain biking maybe. So that's something with the right system and a high enough sample rate, you could probably measure that quite accurately and learn quite a lot. And braking is another thing. Like I don't know how. I'm not entirely sure how relevant braking would be on a road bike, but braking I call it a necessary evil because it creates so much disruption on a mountain bike anyway, where it starts the bike starts moving laterally, it moves riders' weight distribution all over the place, it changes geometry. You're asking the tires to multitask, which they don't do very well. They're trying to deal with reducing speed as well as maintain grip. And I feel like in a road race situation, if you can understand what the bike's doing or what happens under braking with the rider and the bike, then you have the potential to learn quite a lot, I think.
Yeah, interesting. So I think I'm hearing you correct. So you're saying that you think frames are overly stiff in downhill right now, or are they trending towards less stiff?
They're trending towards less stiff. You're seeing.
Okay.
I first saw it on the Commencal Supreme when I was working at Commencal. Part of their prototype development of the current downhill bike was a bridge that sits between the seat stays that you can take out and put in different thicknesses, so you can adjust the compliance of the back end. And typically, it is at the moment what we see is the back end that causes a lot of problems. That swing arm area, if it's overly stiff, that makes a bike very hard to ride, especially in a particularly rough track. The rider is being fatigued trying to fight the bike and keep it where they need it to be. And adding compliance in the frame allows the bike to mute some of that and become easier to ride. And a lot of that comes, we see a lot of it in the construction of wheels as well, spoke tension, rim material, rim stiffness, and like carcass construction, sidewalls of tires. You can those are the variables you can control a lot more than frame compliance if you don't have a bridge that you can change, or allowing the wheel to flex is the second best thing to adding compliance to the frame. The more
and are you seeing that?
Sorry.
No, sorry. And are you seeing that in multiple like modes of stiffness, like around different axes? Like, is it just vertical, or are you like torsional?
It's mainly, I see it mainly torsionally, allowing that rear axle or the back end of the bike to rotate rather than flex left or right. Allowing it to twist means that the bike can adapt to line changes and gradients and cambers a lot better. And if you can do it in the frame, you haven't necessarily got to then compromise your wheel structure or your tire pressures and grip levels to do that. So I've seen it in different manufacturers as well. Like the new Mondraker prototype bike has got 3 different positions where you can adjust the stiffness just in the rear end with 3 different, I believe it's 3 different positions and 3 different braces in each position. So there's almost an infinite way of fine-tuning that back end to give the rider what they need it to do. So you don't have to back off spoke tension and potentially compromise the integrity of the wheel. And at rough tracks like Val d'Isole or Fort William, the last thing you want to do is potentially have a wheel failure because you're trying to find grip or get the bike to behave how you want it to behave.
Interesting. Cool. Well, I'm going to keep my eye on that then. I didn't know we were that was happening. That's pretty exciting. Because I've been a huge advocate for years. I think bikes have just gotten way too stiff. Everybody's trying to win the magazine test, and the fact is that stiffness is it's not it's not the be all end all. And I mean, I think we've seen that. I mean, you're probably familiar. Was it like the early mid 2000s when Ducati went through that thing in MotoGP? They had realized they'd made their swing arm too stiff, and they were, I mean, when I grew up engineering, it was like make it as stiff as possible and let the suspension work. And then they were the first ones I can remember to show up and go, oh yeah, actually we made it way too stiff and the suspension had to work way too hard. And they started going backwards with it. And I remember that being an eye-opener at the time and making me rethink some of the cycling stuff. Like, we're probably doing the same thing. And
yeah, there's definitely the case. And you've seen it in motocross as well. I'm not overly familiar with that, but I've seen that some manufacturers went to aluminium frames from steel frames, and that made the bike unrideable or really uncompetitive because it's inherently stiffer and lighter, which is everything that you on paper probably that you'd want from a bike, but in reality when you're riding a bike at a high level and really pushing it, a bit of compliance in the frame, and especially that they do a lot with their swing arms as well, and MotoGP. You can see them. Yeah. You can see when a MotoGP bike's tipped over. I've seen slow-mo footage of the back end flexing and twisting as they go around a corner, and you imagine if that wasn't allowed to happen, how much more the suspension, the rider, the tire is having to fight that. So yeah, it's definitely a trend we've seen in cycling for a long time, and I don't think it's been the right direction to go.
I agree.
Well, Nick, before we cut you loose here, if there's something you could have or some type of information or data you could gather that's a little out of your reach right now, do you have an idea what's just a little elusive to you right now? What would that be?
So I am working on a way to measure real-time temperatures during a run of various elements, whether that's brake calipers or shocks. That to me would be really useful. So I'm working with a company called Stendec, and we're trying to develop a system that can do that, as well as all the other suspension stuff we need. But being able to measure with strain gauges or some sort of sensor, if we can measure what the frame is doing, the chassis stiffness and the compliance of the chassis itself, that's something that I would find fascinating, and I could do a lot of FFT stuff on that.
Yeah, especially now that you can adjust it, it would be really helpful to know something about it, right? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep my eye on that. I think that's super cool.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's going to be a game changer, and a lot of mountain bike brands are becoming clever to it. But at the minute, measuring it in a real world environment, measuring it in the lab is relatively straightforward. Measuring it in the real world environment at the minute is just relying on what the rider prefers, and that, like I said before, that's part of the picture. Understanding, being able to put a number to that or being able to visualize it in a different way would be really, really cool.
Awesome.
Well, Nick, this has been a really cool deep dive, folks. You can check out Dynamics. You can certainly hook up with Nick and get your own bike set up if that's what you feel like you need. You probably do. It sounds like it, because most of us probably got all our settings way off at this point. So, Nick, thanks for what you're doing. Thanks for the information, the tutorial here on suspension and all that's involved there on the World Cup level and even at the amateur level. We appreciate you coming on Marginal Gains.
No, thank you. I appreciate being here and being able to waffle for an hour. I love it.
It's been great. Thanks a ton, Nick. We'll chat soon.
No worries. Thank you.